Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rhodes Centre first talk of this semester. And thanks for coming on this very, very cold day. I hope that you got as het up as I did with the warnings that it was going to be the coldest day in human history and we would all die, and the usual sort of panic over the weather. Yes, it's cold, but come on, really, it's getting a bit ridiculous. Anyway, delighted to bring Tim and Ted here today. They'll do their bios in a minute. A little bit about how this came about. This came about because A, it's a really interesting story, I'd love to hear it, but B, because I was wrong. Now, what was I wrong about? It's impossible that I'm wrong, right? That's totally ridiculous. No, I was wrong. See, what happened was, when this thing was Build Back Better, I basically kept saying to everyone in public, on Twitter, all the rest of it, never going to happen. Why? Because Manchin's never going to fold. He's going to look after the, if you will, the local growth model of the Virginia economy, which is heavily reliant, not so much on coal itself, but on, if you will, the wages and taxes that are generated by that sector broadly construed. And he's just not going to go against it. And there was that sort of second or third occasion, these guys will remind us, when it looked like it really wasn't going to pass, and I was like, see, told you so. And then, out of the blue, turned round and noticed we've just now called it the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's actually the same thing, and we got exactly what we wanted. And I was like, damn, I was wrong. Why was I wrong? I'm going to have to talk to these guys to find out. And that's why we're here today. So with that, a little bit of background. I'm going to introduce Dr. Tim Sahay. He's a physicist from MIT, Senior Policy Manager of the Green New Deal Network, and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. And then Ted Furtick, he is a historian, also a doctor. Herr Doctor, if he was in Germany, actually, but that's fine. From Yale University, he is senior strategist at the Grassroots Power Project, as well as senior policy strategist for the Working Families Party. And their fingerprints are all over this. So I'll let them explain themselves. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Welcome to Brown.
Thanks, Mark. It's lovely to be here. There's room in the front if folks are trying to find their way in. So Tim and I are going to speak, I think, for about 25 minutes. We're gonna split it in half. I am going to talk a little bit about the prehistory, let's say, of Build Back Better and the Inflation Reduction Act, how Bidenomics came to be in concept. And a little bit about what happened when it encountered the political system in the form of Senator Joseph Manchin III of the great state of West Virginia. And then Tim is going to talk about how they actually got something through the United States Congress and through Manchin by way of the policy design and what implications we think that has for political economy and American politics going forward. And then I think we've got time for a conversation. Oh, I have this thing up here. Okay. Good. So let's go back in time to the mid-2010s. Some interesting and strange things were starting to happen. I'm going to talk about three, let's call them mega trends, that help to explain our present. So the first is this idea of secular stagnation, that growth rates across the advanced capitalist world were dramatically slowing. It was becoming increasingly difficult to generate growth. Larry Summers made himself famous for the 15th time in his life and career by reintroducing Alvin Hansen's late 1930s idea of secular stagnation. And that coincided in time with the so-called populist revolt, or whatever you want to call it, in the United States, and of course, many other countries as well. Represented, it's important to note, if we're thinking from the perspective of the U.S. policymaking elite, represented both by Trump and Sanders, whatever disagreements one might have with that characterization. And Donald Trump did then go on to win the presidential election in 2016, so that was a big deal. During Trump's administration, something really strange was happening that people started to notice around that time. This chart is showing you, in the red line, you have U.S. fiscal deficits as a percentage of GDP. And the blue line on top, you have core PCE, personal consumption expenditures, which is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. And what you see is that we're running these gigantic fiscal deficits, which Trump ratchets up with his tax cuts in 2017, and then go to just staggering proportion with the coronavirus relief bill in mid-2020, and inflation absolutely does not move. You cannot detect a trend anywhere in that line. And that starts to open people's eyes about the possibility for big government spending. Then, of course, we have this gigantic economic crisis. I think this is one of the greatest and most horrifying infographics of all time. This chart on the left that the New York Times published on their front page is showing you the weekly new unemployment claims for every week dating back to the early 2000s. You can see in the Great Recession, it never got much higher than about 500,000. And then in 1 week at the beginning of the COVID crisis after the shutdowns, spikes to 3 million and change. By a couple of weeks later, it's above 6 million, and we have almost 40 million new unemployment claims in the space of a couple of months. So gigantic economic crisis. Okay, next megatrend, climate. So probably the most convenient place to date this is 2018 with the release of the IPCC's report on 1.5 degrees, which I think really did send a shockwave through a lot of policymaking circles, that climate change was real and that it threatened not only ecosystems but political systems around the world, and that the consequences for politics were going to be quite significant and dramatic. At the same time, and not unrelated, the consensus, the elite consensus around carbon taxation as the way to address climate change from a policy perspective really started to crack. There's an article, essay from Leah Stokes and Matt Mildenberger about carbon pricing, but this was one of many such sort of think pieces that you could find at the time. And sort of alongside this, there is this new left-wing insurgency that is really starting to rock American politics, maybe most visibly with the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a stunning primary upset in 2018. And then, Bernie Sanders almost did win the Democratic primary in 2020. And the core sort of mainstream of the Democratic Party and its policy-making elite felt that they needed to respond to that. One of the most visible manifestations of that was these task forces, joint Biden-Sanders task forces after Biden stitched up the nomination. And climate was a huge piece of that. And we saw later on that year, Biden revised his climate plans from the primary to make them dramatically bigger. This is where Tim and I come in just as individuals. Tim is staff at the Green New Deal Network. I am staff at the Working Families Party, which is one of the anchor organizations. This was a coalition of groups that came together starting in 2019, 2020, basically to push the left flank of a climate, jobs, and justice agenda if and when Democrats won the White House and Congress. Okay, last megatrend. We have secular stagnation and political crisis connected to it. We have climate. And the third megatrend is China. An illustrative example, this is Kurt Campbell, who was the top China hand in the Obama White House, Jake Sullivan, who was Hillary Clinton's top advisor when she was Secretary of State, and then the foreign policy advisor on the Biden campaign, and obviously now the national security advisor, and quite easily the most powerful person in the world who most people don't know. Talking about the need for the U.S. to respond to China's growing strength militarily and economically. And what you will find in Sullivan's writings is a lot of emphasis on the need for the U.S. to deal with the strategic vulnerabilities presented by China's centrality to a lot of supply chains. That's certainly connected to clean energy, and in particular a fear that China was set to dominate the industries of the clean energy transition, which by then everyone viewed, because of the other megatrend, as inevitable. Okay, so we can name these three trends, secular stagnation, China, and climate change, and they add up to what I think we could call a crisis of hegemony in democratic capitalism, meaning that the people who were used to being in charge were suddenly worried that they were losing their grip. They were losing their grip as represented in the fact that Trump won the White House and Sanders almost won the nomination in 2020. This growing threat that they perceived from China and the political threat, as well as the climate threat from greenhouse gas emissions. And all of these things are interconnected in some really tight and we think important ways, which we can get into in discussion. So what emerges from this is a solution set that's meant to address all of them at once. I think, and we can argue about this, that green industrial policy is really the centerpiece of it. But they also go very big on welfarism in a variety of ways to try to address especially that left-hand column of the triangle or side of the triangle. And broadly, this idea of wage-led growth, right? That inequality was a huge problem, and the way to do it, the way to address it, in part, was tight labor markets that would drive up wages. And in a world where you don't really fear inflation anymore, which they stopped fearing sometime around 20 or 2021, this starts to seem like a really good idea. Okay, so then in 2020, at the end of 2020, we didn't really find out until late. Joe Biden won the presidential election. And then in early 2021, on the same day, we have this pretty wild juxtaposition, which is that Democrats win a surprise 2 special elections in Georgia, which gives them this 50-50 majority in the U.S. Senate, which no one was expecting. And we have the sort of apotheosis of the populist threat, whatever we want to call it, with the January 6th riots, which I think just convinces them that this analysis is the correct analysis. So Biden comes into the White House naming 4 crises that his administration is going to address: the coronavirus pandemic, economic collapse, racial justice, and climate change. And you can see in this that there is this real left inflection, at least to the way that he's talking, which has to do with the depth of the coronavirus crisis, which has to do with the strength of the Sanders movement. Whatever set of factors, there is this sort of pivot or feint to the left in how Biden launches his administration. In a quieter voice, we start to hear a lot about what we could call protectionism, or sort of the Bidenomics version of America First. So they're going to make it in America, they're going to invest, but they're going to make it in America. And we start to hear, and it's everywhere if you look for it, about China. It's not the thing that they lead with, but it's in every single statement, every speech. You will hear something about how all the things they're going to do are going to position the U.S. to effectively compete with China. What comes out of this synthesis in about April 2021 is these 2 things: the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. We don't have time to get into them, but they are massive. It's $4.5 trillion of proposed spending over 10 years. You got childcare, you got climate, you got elder care, you've got community college, you've got more climate, you've got supply chains, you've got all this stuff. It's really gigantic, and pretty much no constituency can look at this and not feel like the thing that they care about is not represented. And as far as I think Tim and I agree on this, like, they mean it. If they could have gotten this through Congress, Biden would have signed it in a heartbeat. Okay, so then what happens? That's April. That takes us up to April 2021. Well, the biggest challenge, of course, is that Democrats have this majority in the Senate. They have 50 votes. They need every single one of them. And in Manchin, you have some real challenges. As Mark has indicated, he's from this state that has serious natural fossil fuel interests. I think coal gets overstated. I think the real game for Manchin is gas. West Virginia's gas output increases by a factor of 10 between 2010 and 2021. So this is the growth industry for West Virginia, and it really matters. He also loves bipartisanship. There's a very specific political reason for that. His state voted 70% for Trump, so he can't be a liberal in a conventional sense and hope to get reelected. And then he is just an honest-to-goodness conservative. He talks about the entitlement society as something he hates, but he also doesn't like tax cuts for the rich. And he is, as far as anybody can tell, a genuine budget and inflation hawk. You also have Senator Sinema from Arizona, elected in 2018. She has this weird background on the left, but I think came to despise the left based on those experiences. She runs for Senate, and her main plank is that she's going to tackle prescription drug prices. She then ends up basically torpedoing the Democrats' prescription drug plan in the Senate. She's extremely solicitous of powerful corporate lobbies, especially Pharma and Wall Street. To be honest, I don't think anybody has a good theory of why she does the things that she does. So this, so the Manchin and Sinema vies leads to this first round of scaling back of the ambitions around the Build Back Better agenda, as it came to be called. First in terms of size, they shrink it from it had been $4.5 trillion, then it's $3.5 trillion, with Bernie Sanders and Chuck Schumer pushing that top line number in the Senate. Then it becomes 1.8, maybe $2 trillion. After Manchin and Sinema insist that they won't go bigger than that, and the House passes a $1.8 trillion or $2 trillion bill. Then 2 things happen. So first, I showed you earlier, inflation was a flat line. Inflation is suddenly no longer a flat line. Starting about November of 2021, we really start to see some big spikes. And for Manchin, this is gold because he's been an inflation hawk all along. He's saying all this spending is going to be inflationary. Now he's got the proof, and it really causes him to double down and basically say, I don't need to agree to any of this new spending. And that's where it seems like things are going to end up in December when Mark is prophesying that he's just going to hold the line. But then something interesting happens, which is the war in Ukraine. That ratchets up the inflation fear to the next level. But for Manchin, it also seems to have gotten him serious about energy security. And so when he starts talking about all of the above, by which he means clean energy plus fossil fuels, he's totally in earnest. And so Manchin then manages to get back into negotiations, in part because he sees this gigantic opportunity, right? Natural gas exports to Europe, LNG exports start to surge in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine as Europe can no longer rely on Russian sources of natural gas. And suddenly the prospects for fossil fuels alongside clean energy are pretty spectacular. And that's our working hypothesis about why Manchin decides to get on board. All right, I think I am now... Oh, last thing. So this is, so Manchin gets on board, but of course he gets his pound of flesh. So the whole thing is scaled back massively to about $700 billion total top line. All of the welfare stuff is cut out except for two things that Democrats just absolutely couldn't live without. One is this prescription drug piecing, which is actually a revenue booster. It doesn't cost money, it brings in money. And the second is stuff connected to the Affordable Care Act, the healthcare bill. Everything else is energy and climate. It's paid for with taxes, right? So that happens, right? IRS enforcement, these surtaxes on a slight increase in corporate tax. So it's paid for with taxes that are very progressive in nature, though obviously only a fraction of what Democrats were talking about at the beginning of 2021. Okay, Tim.
Thanks, Ted. All right, so that was the politics of passing it. Now let's have a look at what is this bill. So last summer, as the bill passed, Wall Street Journal ran a headline that should make you do a double take. GOP lawmakers lobby the oil industry to denounce the tax and climate bill. That's right, Republicans were lobbying the oil companies, not the other way around. So Mitch McConnell and other GOP heavyweights frantically emailed the American Petroleum Institute. They were reduced to begging Exxon and Shell to come out against the IRA. But the oil industry basically shrugged and said, no thanks, we are happy with the IRA. Manchin got us what we wanted. The oil barons went as far as to calling for the IRA's swift passage. Here's the CEO of Exxon. It's encouraging to see the desire to catalyze investments. Why was this a fight at all? Why would oil and gas majors, the sworn enemies of the green transition, actively support the IRA? I want to talk to you today about how the designers of the IRA brokered a deal with the major sectors that are threatened by the climate transition. So the key obstacles to decarbonization are the big bosses in 4 sectors: fossil fuels, autos, real estate, and meat or agribusiness. Let's call them the farm sector for short. F, fossil fuels, A, autos, transportation there, a good chunk, R, real estate, and M, agribusiness. The energy transition has long been seen as an existential threat to the farm sectors. They're going to die if we go green. The IRA is designed, as Ted explained, as a set of carrots, no sticks, no penalties for fossil fuels. That's partly a function of the Democrats' very thin majority. They just had 50 Senate votes, so they had to go with this reconciliation process that just means you can't do any regulations. It just has to be carrots, no policies. So the challenge was then using carrots, just more spending, additional spending, to shift the economy onto a whole new growth path rather than just intensifying the current economy. So how did this sort of deal come about? Any kind of deal rests upon 2 competing visions of an asset. There's a buyer and there's a seller. There's a bear and there's a bull. So in this case, this asset is the composition of America's future political economy. No one knows the future, so you can get a deal if two sides have different visions of this future. So in this case, the farm sector firms, those fossils, autos, real estate, and meat, get off-ramps. They get generous incentives to continue doing a lot of their existing activities, but they have to add carbon capture technologies. But the IRA simultaneously unleashed a powerful new set of green interest groups that could potentially overtake the farm sector. This is a wonderful slide by Goldman Sachs. I think it was in 2020 as this bill is being designed. And you can see there's money for everyone. So this is the mismatch, right? There's two visions, one in which these new interest groups could be an existential threat to the farm sectors. You could rapidly reduce oil and gas demand forever and ever if all of these green technologies come about. Or maybe they can just coexist and everybody wins. So that's the two sort of visions. And maybe the transition is smooth. Maybe an automaker, a Ford, can just transition to making EVs without anyone losing their jobs. EVs are a growth opportunity for Ford and GM, who also aggressively lobbied the Biden administration. In other cases, it's less obvious that farm sector firms will survive this new competition, because if you get wind and solar at scale, it would just overtake fossil fuel energy. No one would need to dig out coal and gas and burn them in a power plant. And that's why gas-heavy utilities fought IRA to the death, and they lost. So I want to run you through some of the design principles of this bill, and we can discuss the political economy that they're trying to bring into existence. The first design principle is pretty simple. It's only carrots, no sticks. So it's absolutely pain-free private sector investment. So green technology, as everybody knows, is highly capital intensive. It's very expensive upfront, but then it's free to run. The sun is free, the wind is, and wind blows freely. So solar panels might save you money in the long run, but do you really want to shell out cash for equipment and installation upfront? That's the financing problem, and that's a hurdle even when borrowing is cheap, when you have easy money. But now we are in a world of expensive money. Interest rates have gone up. So it's even less attractive for banks to borrow for these kind of long-term investments that are going to be good for everyone, but they're expensive upfront. Enter the IRA. The IRA, the bill uses this enormous artillery of public finance. It gives you grants, it gives you tax credits, it gives you loans, it gives you guarantees, as long as a firm or a local government or a school or an individual is willing to do green projects. The government wants to make this kind of green spending as painless as possible. That means taking the risk of default off the hands of investors. If you sell a fleet of heat pumps to low-income homeowners or renters and they don't make the payments, we'll cover the costs. Now, should the public sector be taking on those kind of risks? Isn't the point of private sector investments for capitalists to swallow some risks? You might call this privatizing the profits and socializing the losses, but here's why I'm a little less cynical. It's not forever. As green technologies are deployed, they become cheaper. And as they get cheaper, they go into more schools and more car parks and more homes. The cost comes down on a per unit basis. The goal of the public sector taking these risks is to midwife the birth of a new competitive green economy, and then leave it to private sector and individuals to bear investment costs. Okay, so that's design principle 1, just pain-free private sector investment. Design principle 2 is bottomless mimosas. Why bottomless mimosas? Okay, so this is fun. There's all these deficit talks in Congress. They don't like spending being more than the taxes that you're bringing in the bill. So there are deficit talks, Biden himself, Manchin, Janet Yellen, and the deficit talks in Congress imposed a very hard constraint. You can't spend, no spending limit. You can't spend more than you take in. So the bill couldn't increase the deficit. In fact, the bill, as Ted was pointing out, it actually brings the deficit down by taxing rich people and corporations more than it spends. So it's a deficit reduction bill. That's what Manchin wanted. So how are progressives going to get all of that green mimosas flowing? So how do you do that? You create completely uncapped tax credits. So you create these tax credits that are these bottomless mimosas where the Treasury is just going to give you $2,000 to install heat pumps or to retrofit your homes. It's going to give a green producer of solar or wind electricity $30 per megawatt hour that they make. So it's going to give you all of these carrots. And the Treasury just doesn't have any spending limit on them. And these are extremely generous. It should bring down the costs of your utility bills. It could raise the price of your property. So this is good. And if you're a producer of green electricity, it's an enormous gift to automakers, to agribusiness, and just about any manufacturer of goods you can find. And as we were working on this bill, I found myself wondering, do the deficit hawks actually know what's been smuggled in? Do they know about the bottomless mimosas? Because maybe they would try and stop it. And I think perhaps, perhaps you actually have to know what the future is going to be like to think that, you should try and stop it. And maybe they just thought we're going to win and we're going to keep this really low. So let me just give you a specific example of the EV tax credit. So the Treasury says that, we've given you $7,500 as a discount if you go and get an EV at a dealership, but no one knows how many people are going to take it up. So the bill just changes the law of the land and says, here's $7,500 if you get an EV. So the Treasury just assumes only 10 million people will take this. So they just say, this new tax credit that we have given out, just about $10 billion is what we estimate to pay out over the next 10 years. But what if 100 million people go and get an EV for the next 10 years? What if right now it's about 1 in 20 cars in the country sold as an EV? In 3 or 4 years, it could be 1 in 3. At which point you could get, tens and tens of millions of people taking an EV every year. And so the Treasury could end up giving you bottomless mimosas. It didn't know what it signed up for, and all of a sudden it's giving you $100 billion. And that basic example is generalizable to all of these tax credits. They are all bottomless mimosas. And we could just be lowballing the spending of this bill. And don't just take it from us. There's Credit Suisse saying the same thing to investors. Hey, these guys just put bottomless mimosas. Get your friends in. And it's brunches on us. Okay, so the climate economy could explode, and that's the second design principle. The third design principle is to compensate the losers of the energy transition. And this is a big one. There's a lot of firms that could just lose out from the energy transition, and all of their assets essentially go to zero. So what happens to a coal power plant? What happens to a gas power plant? What happens when they become less and less economically competitive against renewables? Manchin himself is from an Appalachian Basin state, which is ground zero for this kind of transition. It's a coal and gas state that could go to zero. 4,000 or 5,000 power plants are likely to shut down across the country over the next 10 years. And so Manchin just laid down the law. You have to invest in cleaning up those places and retooling those factories and and retrofitting them. So what the bill has is a $250 billion loan program at the Department of Energy that basically tells each of those owners of stranded assets, here's money. Now go and do something to shut yourself down or to retool yourself with CCS or with any other technology off-ramp so that you could still keep making money. Okay. The next design principle is how do you deal with the fact that you can't just green everything up because those technologies don't exist. We don't really know how to clean up fertilizers or petrochemicals or make cement or steel and other juggernauts of heavy industry that are enormously carbon intensive. And green technologies aren't just going to compete them out of existence anytime soon. So you want to minimize those enduring harms. So the IRA has no sticks, remember? So you can't just use regulation to say, stop producing this harmful pollution. You can't just say that. You can't just take away their license to operate. The EPA can't just go in there and say, right, if you're this dirty, we stop you from operating next year. So if they were going to continue to operate, we need to minimize the harms. So how do you minimize harms? You slap on carbon capture and sequestration technology, and moreover, you give Wall Street some sort of stake in it. And what the bill does, it just gives you $85 per ton of captured carbon. So you get a payout for every ton of carbon that you capture. So right now, this sort of CCS pipeline industry is a glint in someone's eye. They don't exist. Right now, pipelines run from the Permian, and they take out oil and gas, and they take it to your factory. This is a proposal to run these pipelines in reverse. Okay, so you send the carbon captured from the smokestack, you put it into a pipe, you take it all the way down, and you sink it into a hole in the ground. So that's kind of crazy. It's not been done before. And what this bill is hoping to achieve is tens of thousands of miles of carbon pipelines for these stranded industries. And the hope is if you give them money and you make these pipelines work out for them, then they don't fight you to the death and they just sort of get a new revenue stream. And as you may have heard, CCS may not work out. The pipelines could break. The places where you sink them into the ground could leak. This technology has failed repeatedly. And this is actually a wonderful article in the New York Times by people who ran one of these companies and said, it didn't work, our company failed, and this is why. So why do we expect it to work this time? The last design principle of the IRA is Make in America. As you heard Ted say, it's premised on being sort of an anti-China bill. It says you've got to make all of these batteries and wind turbines and solar panels in America. And in so doing, it's going to create a lot of factories and jobs in America. And what we have been seeing is that the IRA is actually a tool to get buy-in from purple states and red states, because just de facto, a lot of these factories are being set up in red and purple states. There's not a single Republican that voted for this bill. Remember, it's a 50 Democratic senators and Democratic votes in the House, not a single Republican vote. But lo and behold, a lot of these investments are flowing to purple states and red states, who are already some of the nation's largest green producers. So the bill just sort of directs these bottomless mimosas to red states. And the hope is that that gives the bill some enduring permanence. When the Republicans come into power, they may not overturn the entire thing. So that could be 2024, it could be 2028. We don't know, but the idea is that there are some interests in those red and purple states that like it. So how did all of these sort of disparate groups sort of come together? Nothing really brings together people like a common enemy. And that enemy was, the green industrial policy that Ted was talking about. That rhetoric is wrapped in this anti-China rhetoric, which is the one issue that American elites, whether they're NatSec hawks, national security hawks, or they're trade hawks, or whether they're fiscal deficit hawks, all of them wholeheartedly agree on being anti-China. America cares about where manufacturing happens, and it doesn't matter how many batteries the EU makes or how cheap the Chinese EVs are. This bill basically says, thanks for making all those batteries. Thanks for all this great big battery boom going on in Europe and going on in Asia. We want none of it. All of these batteries are going to be homegrown. The minerals are going to be sourced from America. And they're going to be sourced from countries that America has a free trade agreement with, such as Canada, such as Chile. But they're explicitly not going to be sourced from the EU. Or, that's why Macron, hot-footed it to Washington in December, saying this is super, super aggressive against us, and you need to give us entry into your market. And the same is true for the South Koreans. The same is true for a lot of countries who are who've been sort of iced out from the super lucrative American market. And obviously the big US and Canadian mining companies are, licking their chops as we speak, because they get a massive subsidy to come in and develop more mines from North America. So if you want a single sentence summary of this bill, it's America actually cares where stuff is made. This may not have been true in the last 30, 40 years of globalization, but now it is. That's where the anti-China sort of component really comes out. America cares about where stuff is made, and this bill is full of carrots and bottomless mimosas to make that happen. So to conclude, you might notice that one of those 4 farm sectors that I laid out at the start, fossil fuels, autos, real estate, and meat, one has gone pretty much ignored. There's very, very little money in IRA for real estate resilience. And if you've seen, the amount of disasters that happened just last year or any year, there's a wonderful website run by NOAA called $1 Billion Disasters. And if you look it up, every year there's over 30 or 40 billion-dollar disasters. And the last 3 decades of the housing cycle has built up an enormous amount of flood and fire risk. So there's a growth of single-family homes in California. There's this growth of homes in the floodplains in Texas and in Florida. And the IRA doesn't really touch this problem. And for my money, this is the mother of all sunk costs, stranded assets, entrenched constituency, climate, political economy problems. You think oil and gas is expensive to buy out? Try American housing. It's the flywheel of the world economy. And to make these things even harder, most land use decisions are made at the local and state level. So those property taxes fund schools and they fund services. So if you are going to take on the real estate industry, that's going to require pitched battles in every climate vulnerable county in America. And that's not going to be pretty. And that's perhaps why it was best left for another day. All right, that's it from us.
You can do your own Q&A. Just put your hands up and get started. There we go. I think Alice is in first.
Sure. Thank you for this wondrous whirlwind tour through Green Punch. I had a few questions on the topic of subsidies. So as we see the EU is sort of panicking about toxic or harmful green subsidies and
Oh yeah, we would need mics because there are people listening via YouTube.
sorry,
We'll have to start again.
online folks. So my question is about subsidies, and in a bill which is mostly about carrots, so we're increasing green carrots. I wonder where you see the evolution of carrots for brown stuff, right? So fossil fuel subsidies. How difficult is it to remove those carrots which are already pretty entrenched?
I mean, I think we can say, for people like us, one of the things that we went into this fight trying to push for was the elimination of existing fossil fuel subsidies, right? And the part of what was a bitter pill to swallow for progressives was that we not only didn't eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, with the exception of there was an important thing around methane that's in the bill. There's this whole new carbon CCS subsidy regime that's been built in. Nobody knows actually how it's going to play out, right? Because if the technology is a total bust, nobody's going to get any money out of that subsidy program. And I think there's a little bit of a wager in there that the technology just doesn't ultimately pan out, and we don't end up subsidizing a totally failed way of dealing with carbon pollution. But it's a real sticky thing, and probably folks who followed the in and out know that one of the things that Manchin managed to get in there, which I don't even know what the ultimate implications are, but it was just especially bitter pill to swallow, was this tying of new wind, but particularly wind leases on public lands to new fossil leases on public lands on like a 1-to-1 basis, which seemed totally unprecedented. So all of that stuff is in there. I think it is a direct reflection of the political power that this one pivotal senator from a fossil state had, and also of the way that the Ukraine war has upended the global geopolitics of energy, right? Where I think suddenly the Biden administration felt that whatever ambitions they had about curbing fossil fuel use, suddenly we're in a world where our geopolitical objectives require us to export more LNG than we ever dreamed of. And that, was I don't think they wanted to be in that situation, but that's where they found themselves. And that's, I think, a big part of the reason they didn't put up a bigger fight about some of those things that Manchin wanted to include at the end. Can they be gotten rid of? I think that totally depends on the political power that progressive forces can build in the future, because there's no reason why they can't be gotten rid of. It's just in the text of the law. It can be taken out, right? But it's there because of the political power that those interests had at that pivotal moment.
And just one thing on fossil fuel subsidies, the bill that the House passed, the Build Back Better Act in November of 2021, does have sticks. It eliminates fossil fuel subsidies. It bans fossil fuel companies from drilling in the Atlantic or on the Pacific or on publicly owned lands in New Mexico and elsewhere. So it did pass the House. It did get 218. I can't remember if it's 220 votes in the House. So there is enough political, and the Biden administration did a campaign using removal of fossil fuel subsidies, and all of us from Greenpeace, Sierra Club, all of us pushed very hard to keep that in the bill. And this is just a completely new bill because the circumstances completely change. Fossil fuel prices go up. And if you're in oil, and if you've been seeing the news, Exxon's been making money hand over foot. It's the highest profits it has ever made in like 20 years. So that's money directly going from your pockets into the pockets of fossil fuel companies' shareholders and the oil and gas countries of the world, the Saudis and the Norways and so on. So these subsidies are definitely sort of like a distributional conflict between consumers and producers of fossil fuels. And if that distributional conflict changes, if fossil fuel prices go down substantially, they have less firepower to fight you, and that could be a time to do it. And just so that, it just seems very sort of conjunctural. It could have, the Italians passed a fossil fuel windfall tax bill. The Brits passed a fossil fuel tax bill. The Indians with massive, coal state-owned companies passed a fossil fuel tax bill. It's possible. Canada did it. Lots of countries that have oil and gas and coal production passed it. It just so happened in this Congress, if you have 50 Democratic votes and 50 Republican votes, and a few of those Democratic senators are from oil and gas and coal states, they can stop you.
Oh, thanks. Hi, great talk. I have 15 questions, so I'm only going to ask one, which is about the Republican Party, which wouldn't even be where my mind normally goes, but I'm really curious because I almost feel like there's an unintended consequence of the IRA and the broader paradigm shift around green industrial policy or industrial policy writ large, also including the CHIPS Act, et cetera. And we, could have a longer conversation about that bipartisan alignment itself. But what I'm wondering is if there's like an unintended consequence of the IRA of shifting or providing a political opening for Republicans to embrace some version of the energy transition, right? Mm-hmm. And I see this in two ways. One of them you mentioned, but I just want to highlight it, and the other one I'll add. One is the preponderance of EV and battery investments in southern states, which we should note why that is, right? Like, there's been a decades-long strategy of the auto industry, foreign and domestic, to move south to avoid to basically be in right-to-work states and avoid the union density of the historic Rust Belt. So there's a reason for this. Anyway, Republican governors and legislators in those states are super on board with this. They've been explicitly appreciative of the IRA subsidies, increasing this pattern, et cetera. So one is you'll have state and local Republican leaders benefiting from and kind of promoting EV and battery investments. On the other end is the extractive side of the supply chain, where, of course, the mining industry has often, not always, but aligned with the GOP on various fronts around permitting, fast tracking of regulation, et cetera. So if we're looking at how all these mines are going to be built, the GOP has a kind of an inroad there with a historic kind of economic ally. And I'm just curious if you could see some version, even in this like 2-year period of GOP, or at least 2-year period of GOP controlling Congress, or in the future of the GOP moving from climate denial, climate silence, whatever it is, into actually a proactive version of the energy transition that leans heavily on auto mining combo in some way, or those are just sectors I study, but maybe there's others that I'm and CCS, the CCS and carbon dioxide removal as well.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I think that there's obviously a deepening culture war around the energy transition. You take your hands off my burgers and my stoves and my cars. But I think there's also an ideological message that the GOP has been making around, and kind of you do polling and you basically find it polls really well with most independents and Republicans. And as I was saying, those wind and solar jobs are mainly in red states. So it clearly works. This is not like a unicorn that I'm talking about. And what works is you don't say the word climate change. You just say something very different. You say, you'll be energy independent. You say, you'll save money. You say, it creates jobs. And people sign up for that. So that'll be the GOP's sort of messaging around this. We aren't going to save the world. You're going to be independent, and you're going to be an energy producer by sticking a solar panel or a wind turbine on your land. And there are these sort of big landowning and farming coalitions that basically get rent, right? You park down a solar panel or a wind turbine, you get rent. So there's money to be made. There's an ideological message by which it works. And these bills, we didn't really talk about how they were split up into the bipartisan bill that got Republican support and the Democrats' only bill. So it's useful to see what went into the bipartisan bill, and what went in there were these hydrogen and CCS subsidies that we were talking about, but also pro-nuclear, pro-CCS, pro-hydrogen, and pro-gas. So those are the contours of a bipartisan common strategy between Republicans and Democrats, that if we have split Congresses from now on, next 2 years, next 4 years, who knows, that'll be their sort of agenda. And as to whether you get these kind of new coalitions emerging in the EV states, there's this wonderful line called the battery belt. It's the Bible Belt is old. The new thing is the battery belt. And it's those same states. It's the states in Georgia and South Carolina and Louisiana that are embracing batteries, again, for just jobs, investment coming in, as you said, non-union states. And they are going to be getting a lot more money there. So that is also, EVs are also going to turn into a bipartisan sort of thing from now on. And most states are just going to ban the sale of oil and gas cars probably by 2030, 2035. And they just won't be made. So this country has about 200 million cars, and all those 200 million cars are going to turn into electric cars sometime over the next 20, 30 years. So somebody's going to make money doing that.
Tim and I have gone back and forth on this about to what extent what we're seeing with things like Brian Kemp luring South Korean battery makers into Georgia and really trumpeting these as classic economic development, state subsidy programs, explicitly highlighting the non-union characteristic of the labor force. To what extent is this new? To what extent is just a continuation of the clean energy politics that date even to the 90s in places like Texas? I think that there's a couple of really big picture questions that are interesting, that are provoked by what you're pointing to. One is that at a certain level, we can probably say that looking back, we'll be able to mark this moment as like the energy transition is happening, right? And the question is, what is going to be the character of it, right? What is going to be the social character of it? What is going to be the environmental character of it? And all of that is up for grabs. But the idea that we're fighting over whether or not it's happening, like probably that's been settled. And I think the other really interesting question for me, and I tried to prod Mark on this on Twitter several months ago when it first occurred to me. He promised to get back to me, but he didn't. That's
what I do when I don't know.
Was what does this mean for the future of essentially the core political coalitions in the country, right? So Mark and Thomas Oatley published, I think, a really provocative piece that everyone should read in 2021 on the carbon coalition versus the post-carbon coalition, right? And that the GOP is fundamentally the carbon coalition, right? If you look at the states where the GOP's strength is drawn from, they're all fossil-heavy states. And states, not just fossil-heavy on the production side, but also the auto industrial sector, right, which has been a mainstay of fossil capitalism for all of modern U.S. history. So is that actually about to break, right? Does the IRA mean that core parts of what were the fossil coalition have now been bought over to the post-fossil coalition or the post-carbon coalition. Does that mean that they switch their political allegiances? Or do you get entrepreneurs like Brian Kemp who see the writing on the wall, see which way the winds are blowing, say, no, we're not ceding these votes, right? We're not ceding these political economy coalition partners. We're gonna bring them into our tent and do it on our terms, with anti-unionism being a core piece. Okay, here's an argument though I've had with a lot of friends on the left. There was a lot of headline attention to the fact that some of the core pro-labor aspects of Build Back Better were stripped out. So the original draft version included something called the Protecting the Right to Organize Act as a plank of the bill, which was a really sweeping expansion of labor rights and enforcement powers on the part of the labor board in the US. It was always questionable whether that was going to survive the reconciliation rules, but it didn't get that far. It just got stripped. The other thing that was really visibly taken out was the union bump on the EV credits. So the original bill had a $7,500 EV credit for any EV, including foreign-made EVs, and the discrimination, such as there was for domestic EVs, was that you got a bonus of an additional $4,000 or $4,500 if it was made in a union shop, which meant that was going to directly privilege GM and Ford and penalize Toyota and Honda and other who have their plants in the South. Manchin stripped that out and did this weird thing that nobody saw coming, which is to impose these massive domestic content requirements, which is why the Japanese and the Koreans and the Germans are up in arms. But so those anti-union or sort of scaling back of labor ambitions made a lot of headlines, and rightly so. But the bill still did contain these really important pro-labor propositions. So in particular, prevailing wage is attached to all of the clean energy tax credits, so the bottomless mimosas that Tim talked about. You get extra points on those credits. You get extra federal money if you use prevailing wage, which means not necessarily union labor, but labor that's basically paid at the union wage scale, which eliminates the sort of bottom cutting that non-union contractors can use, makes it easier for labor to organize, and even if they can't organize the workers, still their union wages are not being undermined. Also, they want apprenticeships. So again, it does not union jobs, but unions control the apprenticeships. So you have people coming through your apprentice programs. These were big wins, especially for the building trades unions. What the bill does not have, I was just talking to someone in DOE about this yesterday, what the bill does not have is any labor stuff on the manufacturing side of things, right? So all the supply chain stuff, because there is no union premium or protection or anything in it, is of course going to the historically anti-union states, which have been trying to siphon jobs away from the unionized parts of the country by dint of offering right to work, which means it's really hard to organize unions, for 100 years, right? And so in that sense, like this deep continuity with the way that economic development politics have worked in the US literally for a century now. So it remains to be seen. The Biden people, I think, don't like this, right? They don't want all the jobs to go to anti-union states. They don't want they want the political coalitions to expand, as Tim is talking about, and to get the lock-in effects on climate policy by having a broader constituency, not just partisan Democrats in blue districts who are in support of the legislation. But they also want political benefits for themselves, and they want better quality jobs. So I think they're looking for ways that within the restrictions of the law that they're dealing with, that they can not have all the money flow to Georgia. But it's a really tough situation based on what they were and weren't able to get in the law itself.
Jeff, you want as well, Tony? Or what? Yeah, so after the Kane down to Tony.
Great, thank you guys so much for the presentation. I wanted to come back to this idea about how big oil is being, getting all kinds of windfall taxes in other countries, but not in this one. And I think part of the explanation for that, there's several, but part of it is the fact that U.S. gasoline prices have stayed relatively moderate, right? So people are less pissed off. Everybody wins, right? Exxon's making money, but my gas tank isn't going up. But the thing that is happening at the same time, and that lots of those big oil companies are not just oil companies, they're also natural gas companies, is that gas and electric bills for residents are going through the roof, right? They're like, in Rhode Island, they went up 50%. Mm-hmm. And so one thing that strikes me and is kind of interesting, so I understand as political scientists that gasoline prices are much more politically salient to people, right? They're in people's faces, and yet over time we're not idiots, right? We realize as homeowners that we're paying a whole lot of more money to heat our homes and to power our homes, and so why is is the left not thinking more about linking those big energy price increases to coal and gas and not so much oil, but coal and gas that powers most of the U.S. electrical grid. So something to think about, and to the profits that those companies are making right now.
I mean, I would say it's a great question, but I would say I think some people are thinking about that. There's a candidate for state legislature in New York who won an election in an area around Kingston, basically campaigning on the idea that people's energy prices were going up because Con Ed was blocking passage of a bill that would turbocharge the development of renewables, publicly owned renewables. And there was a very specific piece of legislation that she was pointing to. And I think it worked, in that constituency to make the case. I haven't seen that achieve, exit velocity as a political strategy, but I think there's a lot there. I think a lot of people who are thinking right now about that this very strange and interesting situation we're in, where we have this bill, it passed, it's a very complicated thing. There's a lot of things in it we don't like, and it is a massive public investment in jobs, climate, and to some extent good jobs and environmental justice. There are real environmental justice provisions in this bill, not as big as we would like, but they're there. And at the same time, it's so complicated, and the debates about it were so convoluted that most people don't know what's in it and don't understand how it will or won't affect their lives. And so there's a political challenge now to actually go out and demonstrate to people, right, that this can deliver tangible benefits in the form of cleaner air, better jobs, lower utility bills, right? And I think that's a real political challenge because, this was a big, for whatever, complications it has, this was an expansion of the public sector. I count this as a progressive victory even with all the things that I said, right? And I think we need to show people that it works, right? That if you have, a government that takes responsibility for these things, that it makes your life better in concrete, tangible, material ways. And that is how we build the bigger political coalitions over time that will enable us to do battle on some of the things that are bad and win more of the things that are good. So that's a good tactic. There's probably others too, but actually getting this stuff out there, especially because, as Tim pointed out so clearly, right, no sticks, all carrots. You have the money's there if you go and get it, but you actually have to go and get it, which is not necessarily straightforward for a lot of people.
So I was going to feel guilty about asking this question.
Is the mic on, Tony? I don't think it is.
I felt a little guilty asking the question, but now that you've mentioned the political challenges of reproducing this, I wonder whether you could speak a little to the administrative challenge of making sure this bottomless pit of mimosas doesn't turn into, champagne glasses filling with sludge because nobody can police or monitor the use of the credits. And what in the bill is there for that kind of administrative challenge?
Yeah, I can take that. That's exactly the fear. And there is stuff in the bill which basically says, okay, the bottomless mimosas for everyone, but the agency that is giving you the mimosas has to make sure it's not harming people, has to make sure that the project that is getting the money is actually cutting carbon, is actually hiring, paying the prevailing wages that it's supposed to pay, is actually located in disadvantaged communities that want it and aren't fighting it.
The Republicans agreed that the administrative state is going to expand
Right.
enough to enforce
Right.
that on an agency basis?
Yeah, so these are all done by the agency, so by the IRS and by the Department of Energy, and it's through this kind of Justice 40 executive action, which, the Republicans can overturn. But the agencies have been beefed up. They've gotten money in the bill. They've gotten money to do enforcement and technical assistance by actually going to people and saying, this is how you get it, this is how you apply for it. Because if we hadn't put that kind of money in the bill, then none of it happens. And only the well-connected insiders and the firms that, can hire tax lawyers, get the mimosas. And so our goal was to make sure that the agency is staffed up and has to do these public reach-out sessions in every city and state and explain to people how to apply for these funds.
I think though you highlight a really important thing, and from two directions. Because of the reconciliation process and what Tim said about how you basically can't do regulation through that weird budgetary legislative procedure, there was huge limits. Even they wanted to impose standards in the law, and it was really almost impossible to do it. So they basically have this sort of sense, we're going to do standards, and they've directed the agencies to do standards, but it's resting on that agency authority, not on the law itself. And second, a huge part of this is through the IRS. All the tax credits are through the IRS, and that means the IRS has to figure out how it's going to monitor compliance. And that could be bad in two directions. I mean, it could make it harder for regular people to access if the requirements to demonstrate your eligibility become really onerous. But if it's too lax, it could mean that a lot of garbage gets through. I do think that one of the ways, to the political economy question, right, if there's enough sort of political power behind the preservation of the overall structure of the things, but the Republicans want to undermine it anyway, then agency actions is going to be a powerful way that they can do that, right? If they follow through on their threat to, defund the IRS, right, that will mean less tax collection from rich people, but it will also mean less enforcement and monitoring of some of this stuff. And obviously, they can totally revoke any executive action that's done under the Justice 40 thing. I do think my sense is that people in the administration feel a fair amount of urgency to get good stuff in place that sets the tone, that creates the expectations, and that gives them the best hope of those standards surviving, whatever happens in an election 2 years from now or 6 years from now or whatever. But it's definitely a risk in this overall framework.
Further questions? You've had one. You get another one when you get one first.
There are allusions to the Republicans coming back into power. If the Republicans come back into power, what's to prevent them from doing a IRA 2 that provides similar subsidies to the Carbon Coalition?
I mean, you need to win all three levers of power. So right now they have the House, very likely to win the Senate given the makeup in 2024. So they could get a trifecta and then have sweeping control and do, exactly what you described. And the hope is that the good bits will remain, but they'll be added on with even more sort of fossil fuel lard. So that's the bad scenario. That's why this is a completely uncertain state that we are in, and we want to kind of drive the dollars to communities as quickly as the money can get out of the door, so that the Democrats can actually run on this bill in 2024.
Thank you. So my question is, how do we create a coalition of green GOP entrepreneurs? So one of the things that's sort of forever baffled me in the US, of the country of free enterprise and pulling us, ups by our bootstraps, is how do we get this faction of people who are interested in developing those new high-risk technologies, such as CCS or hydrogen? And so, yes, indeed, CCS is a fossil fuel subsidy, but the fact is, to get to 2 degrees, we need some removal of emissions, and bio-CCS is going to be part of it. Likewise, hydrogen can be used to solve the last-mile problem of solar, that you can't run your batteries 100% of the time. And so in the bill, there's a lot of carrots for demand management, right? So for me to buy an EV and to stick a solar panel on my roof to decrease the consumption of fossil fuels. But how do we create this virtuous political economy for the supply side of the transition to build the green stuff and to develop these new technologies? So how do we get those entrepreneurs to take those risks, and how do we get that money towards them? So the US is traditionally very good at innovation, right, at green innovation, notably in Silicon Valley, and we're notably less good at manufacturing the green stuff, which is why the IRA is such a great bill for that. So I'd love to get your take on how do we create this virtuous political economy of folks who have a stake in building the green transition.
I mean, the short answer that I would give, Tim probably knows more on this, is, the Department of, we didn't talk about this much in the piece, but the Department of Energy has gotten a whole bunch of different lending authorities specifically to turbocharge the development of the necessary technologies to do risk sharing, basically to cultivate exactly the class of entrepreneurs that you're that you're talking about. And those pots of money have a lot more restrictions on. They're not bottomless mimosas. They're very actually fixed amounts of money. Most of them have to go out the door in particular windows of time, But if you listen to what's his name, Jiko Shah, who runs the DOE loan programs, he'll give you the entire rundown on exactly what they're planning to do. But they've got a lot in the works, and it's all so much of it is targeted at precisely the technologies that we know we need, but we don't have. There's $6 billion in the bill, like specifically.
No, I mean there's $250 billion. So it is basically a supply side bill. So what you said, it has those carrots on the supply side, not on the consumer side. So an investor gets a 30% discount straight up. You do anything green, you get a 30% discount on your investment cost. You put it in a community that is a stranded oil and gas community, where oil and gas is shut down or coal is shut down, you get another 20%. You pay your workers well, you get another 5-10%. So it's like you can stack these up, and it's like 50-60% of your investment could just be discounted. So it is a supply side bill. It's not just we talked about the bottomless mimosas on the demand side, but they are bottomless on the investment side as well. And then it's just a matter of those entrepreneurs and companies and state partnerships with companies. And that's basically what's happening in New Mexico, in Wyoming, in Texas. There's a lot of sort of state firm coordinations. We're going to set up a green hydrogen hub. We're going to set up a direct air capture thing. And we're going to set up a CCS pipeline. And we're going to do it with entrepreneurs and the state. And these guys can go to the banks and say, hey, we have bottomless mimosas on our asset side. So this revenue is just paid for, give us a loan. Or they can go to the DOE and ask for those loans. So, I think what we have now is a pretty much, this thing is going to be unleashed. The question is, are those firms then going to lobby for more? And that, I have no idea.
So I'll abuse my position and throw in a question. You made me think about something I've been tracking for a while, which is the fatwa which that the GOP has declared on ESG. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if this is, and I hadn't read it this way before, they know they've lost this one. So are they going to try and strangle it on the financing side by basically making it quasi-illegal to invest in green things on any preferential basis? So although the subsidies are there, if you do business in my state attorney general and my state legislature passed a bill that says that this is actually boycotting, which is one of the main tools that they're using. So maybe there's a sort of don't touch because we'll come after you another way. How do you read what's going on with that?
But would they treat just taking up the tax credits as doing ESG, right? If you're doing it because it's just purely cost competitive, right? Not because you're getting some goodie badge on your ESG rating. Right. Would they? I don't know why they would object.
So there's two fronts. The first one started off against asset managers, right? So it's essentially, that you have fiduciary duty to maximize returns. Everything else is a perversion, whatever, right? Then there's the second one, which is the anti-boycott stuff, which is a really inventive reworking of boycott statutes to basically say, if you choose deliberately not to invest in firms X, Y, and Z, then you are boycotting and you run foul of our law. I don't know how they're going to pull this off, but that's the way that it seems to be trending.
Right. I guess I'm just saying, so if you have a wind farm that pencils out because you're getting a 40% investment tax credit from the government, and that makes it cheaper, or a better return on your capital than you would get for some notionally equivalent fossil project, I think it would be pretty easy for the investor to say that we're not doing any ESG anything. We're just making a pure cost evaluation about where we're going to get the best return on invested capital.
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out how that fits into it, because they're putting a lot of time and effort into doing this. And as they said in the Hunt for Red October, son, the Ruskies don't take a dump without a plan. And I'm just wondering if there's some nefariousness going on.
On the ESG culture war stuff, I would suspect that they have not thought it all the way through. I could be wrong, but
at the back.
I kind of had a similar question surrounding messaging on all these issues and the whole idea of this quote-unquote culture war. I'm assuming the laws that you were referencing are laws that Senator DeSantis has put in place in Florida, essentially targeting the major pension funds in Florida who give money to institutional investors like private equity firms, say Blackstone, who literally just raised a $7 billion ESG fund that Florida pension funds, Florida public university endowments wouldn't be able to invest into on the virtue that it's a ESG-focused fund versus being an absolute return-focused fund. I guess I sort of see these culture wars as really effective and sort of unavoidable. You look at DeSantis' resounding win in Florida, and I think it says a lot. And obviously these culture wars are played on many different levels. DeSantis was also a huge proponent of the critical race theory culture war, which again, you know, all those bills were total fluff, right? Because critical race theory isn't even taught at a high school level, but all these bills are getting passed banning critical race theory. And so I guess, and this sort of, they've left, but somebody asked a question up front about the idea of, okay, aren't we smart enough to figure out our energy prices are going up, so we should support these bills because perhaps it can bring some sort of stability to energy costs in the long run, and we're going to drive down costs, we're going to create jobs. I guess I might challenge that notion and say, maybe we aren't that smart, right? And maybe you do need to somehow try to get past these culture wars because they're really effective in driving people to the voting booth. And so I guess how do you win this war as a culture war versus trying to actually reason with people? And I guess I'm also, in a broader sense, challenging the whole idea of, the rational consumer or American or voter, right?
Now you're stumped.
I mean, this could be wrong, right? But it does seem to me that there is a little bit of desperation in some of these plays, especially around climate stuff, in part because there is so much money on the table, right? So you could think of it as that the Republican Party recognizes that that most of the time when Democrats in power manage to pass expansions of things that benefit regular people, they may be unpopular in the instant, but they ultimately pan out politically, right? I mean, Obamacare is like the classic example. They opposed it tooth and nail, even though it was literally the Heritage Foundation's healthcare bill, because they believed that if you actually got a whole bunch of people Medicaid who didn't currently have it, and you got people, their, bans on, what's wrong with my brain, discrimination, pre-existing conditions, and these things would be popular, right? People, and that they would reward politically the political party that was seen as delivering those things. And so I think a big part of the reason why the GOP absolutely was determined to block IRA no matter what, not a single GOP vote, was because they thought it would work, right? Like if it was actually passed, that Biden and Democrats would reap a political benefit from having done this thing that, people want to see action on climate change. They want lower utility bills. They want domestic manufacturing jobs, that these things would be popular. And so when you see the intense determination to use the culture war angle on climate stuff is because they think they're on stronger ground when they're doing the culture war play than if you're just debating the dollars and cents of the policy. So is it effective? I mean, sometimes, and you see why they double down on it, as Tim said, on the burgers, and we're going to get rid of your grills, and we're going to get rid of your gas stoves, and you're going to be eating insects and all these things, right? They do it because that's probably the best hand that they can play. But what I do think is so interesting about this moment is that we're going to see a lot of creativity and people going in different directions, right? So, I think Thea raised the Brian Kemp example. At the same time, you have the GOP going the opposite direction. Like Youngkin in Virginia just blew up this massive Ford battery plant that was going to get built there on the grounds that it was going to be a way to smuggle in Chinese capital into the U.S. And he felt like he needed to bolster his anti-China credentials as the way to advance his own politics. And he was going to do culture war by being really anti-China, even if it meant losing a multi-tens of $billion investment in a very economically depressed part of his state. And and a lot of people, even Republicans, were like, dude, why are you, we need this, we need these jobs. So I don't know, I expect a lot of political creativity and unpredictability in terms of how people try to navigate this new world, and maybe some of the culture war plays will be successful in local instances, but I do think that the amount of money and just the raw economic benefit that's available here is ultimately going to mean that this stuff sticks. Whatever it means for who people vote for, the money, the energy transition, like it's baked.
Just really quickly on this point and connecting it to what Mark asked about, I just read some interesting news analysis that the anti-ESG campaign has had to switch framing from fiduciary obligation to protection of oil and gas assets. So now these Republican governors can't say anymore that it's in the fiduciary obligation to not do ESG because that distracts from the bottom line, because now it is actually beneficial to, more profitable to invest in green industries, and they're explicitly instead saying we want to protect the continuity of energy independence, i.e. fossil fuel, in our state. And so
that's
this is
them in the discriminatory mode, right? Like that totally flips the
well,
balance.
first of all, yes, that's them in the discriminatory, but it's also interesting because it's this wedge happening between like the generalized interest of capital and the fossil capital specific fragment, right? Which were so tied for 150 years, and now you're seeing this opening where the generalized interests of capital are not per se served by the fossil capital fragment, and then weirdly then the partisan politics is realigning around that, but. Very, very weird. I just wanted to throw that out there.
Don, you get the last one.
All right, great. By the way, this has been phenomenal. Just thank you again, both of you. So this is a sort of what is America question. What do we take from this question? So are we the America that Mark predicted, that a lot of people would predict, right? The global hegemon, liberal market economy, basically the worst ever on climate change action, right? Or are we actually sort of a post-IRA, more pro-climate country now? Or was it just a fluke? Was there sort of a structural break? There was a poly crisis. There were some great policy-making ideas from the left that got this thing through. So are we fundamentally a different country than maybe Mark predicted at the outset?
What's your verdict? Hope. You may not be familiar with it. He's asking for hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think investment levels in America are going to go up. Total amount of public investment is going to go up. Total amount of private investment is going to go up. So that's a different American scene than the last 30 years, where you've had this extremely weird thing in capitalism, extremely high profits, very low investment. This has been a puzzle for economists. What the hell is going on? And, that's been a part of that sort of secular stagnation stuff. What is going on? If you have high profits, more firms should be entering into the market to win them. So how come there's low investment? And I think what we've seen is a structural break in the level of total investment in the economy. And that's good. The question is, what is that investment going to go in as far as carbon is concerned? Is it going to go into bigger SUVs and bigger homes and bigger steel factories, or is it going to go into this stuff? And I think, again, there's a structural break that, if you have Goldman happy about it and BlackRock happy about it, they are the ones with the money bags directing the investment arm. It's not, a public sector-led investment green bill. Then, that is a structural break. You're going to get in net more investment and on balance more green investment than non-green investment. What that means for the politics of it is actually, Ted has been talking about this, you might achieve domestic stability. Let's say, the Biden Democrats end up winning over and over again, but you've really cocked up your international allies. So if you have the Koreans upset at you, and the French upset at you, and the Germans upset at you, and the Japanese upset at you, it's not just, this is an anti-China coalition that is not working out for you. So there's this very weird thing of you might strengthen your domestic political stability while upsetting your international position.
The only thing I'll add is that, we didn't end up talking much about China, but I do think that it can't escape the discussion, right? Because one of the ways that I think the China threat or challenge or whatever was understood by the policymaking elite was that U.S. leadership, to use their preferred term on the global stage, was threatened by U.S. foot dragging on climate. So the fact that everybody was aware that there was this gigantic crisis, and the U.S., the largest historic emitter, doing nothing, right, and getting worse under Trump, they felt it was a threat to the U.S. strategic international position. And so I would wager, and maybe someday the research will bear this out, that when you look at why the climate stuff survived but everything else got cut out, a big part of the reason is that a lot of people got together and said the China case on this is unanswerable, right? And then that gives us the real double-edged sword quality of this, because of course we're going to see these higher investment levels. There is going to be an increase in social welfare that comes from this. This will matter for climate. I'm convinced of all those things. And it is clearly paired with this real ratcheting up of the international situation, right? Like it's not just like after the fact that they're grouping this together with chips and with the export bans. Like it is of a piece, and that piece is of a like much more dangerous international environment. And I think we are only beginning to have any sort of intuition of how that's going to play out over the next 10 or 20 years.
Thank you very much. That was awesome.
Thank you.